That's why I want to see you.
Ms. Lee, do you know, does she have a clicker that she keeps on here?
No. The only clicker we got is the one that projected. Sorry.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone. One, I just want to reiterate what I said this morning, which is, I think, just like thank you for pulling together for making today the best possible day. As I looked around the school, and especially this morning at the community meeting, I just saw like so much that was wonderful, and like there are a few things that I am just gonna like call out. And so, like one, I think Ms. Krisman, who I know is working really hard with Amari Forbes, just like pulled her out of line during lunch to like sort of avoid a sticky situation, and then like sat with her and celebrated with her and celebrated her, saying like, "Excuse me," and "Please," and "Thank you." And I think on Fridays when like you have 15 minutes total for lunch, like seeing her do that was just such an act of sacrifice, and it was really wonderful. And then Ms. Wong. I just sort of like saw the energy, and I think BC was like a little wonky as you were walking out of community meeting. I think for a second they thought they were going to win the First Values Cup, and then realized they didn't. And I just thought like you turned it around really nicely. When I popped into the classroom, it was just so warm and wonderful. And then I know, is anyone else from 4th grade here besides Ms. Lee? I think y'all just set up that substitute for success, and he rocked it out. But I also think like people were checking in on him and just helping him out all day long, which was just really, really kind and wonderful. And so I want to thank everyone for, I think, like truly the sacrifice, the love, the kindness. I think at one point there were probably about 20 adults in the building total with, you know, almost 400 kids. And like at no point did you ever feel, yes, I agree. But I also think like at no point did you ever feel like it. And I think, like, yeah, I would take the 20 of you guys over 400 mediocre folks. So we'll get, what? I mean it. Yeah. Yeah, I think like, really like, I'll say this, I've said this in private before, and so I really mean it. Like, I would take any one of you, I would take in the cafeteria with 400 kids before I would have someone who I didn't believe in with 4 kids. Like, really, really mean it. I think that's the power of a great teacher. It's the way. So, you should, like I said, help yourself to food. I know it's a Friday afternoon. I know it's a time of year that's tough. I want us to make the most of this time. So we're going to be talking about key points, and specifically introducing and stamping them. You have a quick break just to start you off. What are some different ways that you introduce and reinforce key points in your classroom? Take like 90 seconds tops. Write an answer. You can turn and talk to the person next to you when you're done. And then I just want to call them out and get a bunch of them on listed and in the air. Take like 10 more seconds. Right, great. Put your pencils down. Let's just quickly get some of these out into the air. So I'm going to just go around and you can either pass or just say one. So Ms. Olika, will you start us off?
Yes. For grammar, we say what we're doing and how we're doing at the beginning, and then before they transition, we say it again.
Great. Ms. Wong. Cool. Ms. Hinch.
I write it on the dry erase board and introduce it in the intro.
Great. That's fine.
Ooh, I have some sort of experience with the kids where they turn and talk about what they listen to, and then I give a name to it with the definition.
Great.
Like music.
Cool.
I was going to say turn and talk to courses. Can do cards that have like I can do this in Spanish by the end of every lesson.
Cool. I'm going to pause right there. So if you did anything like turn and talks, choral response, posting an objective, or anchor charts, we just say, me too.
Me too.
Beautiful. Okay. So I think that what I've noticed, and part of where we come from to start this session, is that we have lots of different strategies and techniques to teach and introduce key points. But we don't always use the right strategy at the right time. And so that's what today's session is really about. So we're going to be talking about stamping key points, and specifically how we, 1, introduce key points, 2, stamp them, and then 3, consolidate them. And we're going to start with a model. And so I'm going to model an ELA lesson where I'm introducing key points. We're going to be using the anchor chart here, so I'm going to just lift up the projector so that you guys can see it. And then if you want to turn, you have a text, I think it's on the 3rd page of your packet, and you'll find that. So if you never just turn and find their text. Okay, so for the purposes of the model, I want you to listen for what I do to introduce our key points. So you know this is a real 3rd grade text that gets used on actually the interim assessment. And you'll see that the question is, or maybe the question isn't posted there actually. So the question is, what is the author's perspective on the aurora borealis? So that's just a little bit of context for the lesson. We're just going to look at the first paragraph. All right, so you're watching What Do I Do and Say to introduce and stamp the lesson's key points. And action. Scholars.
Yes.
Scholars.
Yes.
Great. Today, we are learning to find something called an author's perspective. An author's
Perspective.
An author's
Perspective.
Great. Author's perspective is just a fancy word for the author's opinion. And when we find the author's
Perspective.
the author's
Perspective.
good, we are finding how the author thinks or feels about a topic. So when we find the author's
Perspective.
we're finding how the author
Thinks or feels
about the
topic.
beautiful. Scholars.
Yes.
So I'm going to read this first paragraph about something called the aurora borealis. Your job is to listen and see how I find the author's
Perspective.
great. So, the aurora borealis by James Sullivan. It's winter in Alaska, midnight, 9 degrees above zero. Whoa, that sounded really cold. I'm going to just write that down. You can write that too. And yet there are people, grown-ups, bundled against the cold. Children are clothed in scarves, gloves, and fur-lined boots, outside, looking at the sky. Why? It is because the sky is putting on a show for them. I'm going to underline that where it says, it is because the sky is putting on a show for them. Will you underline that too? And then next to it, I'm going to write exciting or wonderful. Because when someone puts on a show, usually that means they're doing something exciting or wonderful. So let me read that one more time. Why? It is because the sky is putting on a show for them. A show we call the Northern Lights. Scientists call it the aurora borealis. Scholars.
Yes.
So far, I feel like the author feels positive about this topic. Because that phrase, putting on a show, makes me think that the author's perspective, is that the aurora borealis is exciting or wonderful. What did I do to find the author's perspective? Turn and tell your neighbor. Go. You're playing the kids stuff. And then what did I ask myself? Sorry, no, I didn't know. You're playing the kid, yeah. So what did I do? I underlined this, and then what did I do? Great. Scholars.
Yes.
All right. Ms. Pinch is going to tell us what I did to find the author's perspective. Ms. Hinch, go.
Well, first you read it, and then you underlined and annotated a part where you felt he was feeling like something was exciting or wonderful.
Wow, scholars.
Yes.
So, when you find an author's perspective, you look at the author's words. You look at
The author's words.
and then you ask if the author's words, the
Author's words.
are
Positive.
or
Negative.
excellent. Turn and tell your neighbor, how do you find an author's perspective? Go. Great. Scholars.
Yes.
Ms. Lee, how do you find an author's perspective?
You find an author's perspective by looking at the author's words and then asking yourself if the author's words are positive or negative.
Wow. Let me make sure I get that. You look at the author's words and ask if the author's words are positive or negative. Scholars.
Yes.
So I'm going to say go. I want you to read this all together. So to find an author's perspective, we go.
Look at the author's words. Ask if author's words are positive or negative.
Great. So now cut over. So now step out of the model. And then think about what did I do or say to introduce the key points and then to stamp or reinforce the key points. You want to go back to the very first page of your notes and jot down some notes. What did I do or say to introduce and to stamp the key points? Great. Let's just get going right away. Ms. Talley, can you start us off?
Yes. I put that you added motions to the words that you wanted them to really lock in. And this is really important in kindergarten, but you gave a listening job. So just reminding them, like, before you start, here's what you're listening for.
Cool. Can someone add or build on, especially around, so the listening job is one of the first things that happen, and then what happens next? Yes, Ms. Gaines.
Thank you. I noticed that you used a lot of call and response, and then you gradually, at first it was a lot of call and response, and then it became oral response because you wanted them to know what comes next and to not just repeat.
Cool. What else?
You modeled the how, like it was great, and then as we were like listening to you, afterwards there was a turn and talk and you actually like listened and clarified with someone and made sure that they were able to tell us.
Awesome. And then there was one more turn and talk after that. So what is the purpose of the final turn and talk? Yes, Mr. Christian.
It was just a check for understanding to make sure the scholars were able to embody what you were teaching them.
Cool. So consolidating it once we all have it. Great. So hold on to that thought. We're going to transition now to a math example. And if you can just take maybe a minute to read the framing that's right in the box underneath it so that you have a little bit of context for the lesson. It's a second grade lesson.
The one that says see it method.
Yeah. Great. So just to give you some context, this is a second grade math lesson. It begins with the teacher putting up this array of objects and then asking them to make equal groups. So one example would be like this, which is to have 3 equal groups of 5. And then another example would be like this, which is 5 equal groups of 3. And then they make a matching addition sentence. And so you're building sort of up to multiplication right now in the beginning of second grade. So that's a little bit of context. You're going to watch the video. Same type of question. What does this teacher do to clearly and concisely state, reinforce, and stamp the key points after a discussion.
3, 2, 1, and 0. Oh, all hands. Straight backs. Rest. Marilyn. This repeated addition sentence shows the groups because.
This repeated sentence shows the groups because there's 5 groups and they have 3 in each group.
So why do we write the number 3? Jaleel. We wrote 3 because they're.
We wrote 3 because there are 3 in each group.
Why did we write the number 3 5 times? Nafis.
Because there are 5 groups and they all have 3 in it.
Great. Track me. So when you write a repeated addition sentence, what do the numbers tell us? Tell your partner. Go.
The number
The numbers tell us.
The numbers tell us how many are in each group.
What are the number of times we write the number tell us? Noah.
That tells us how many groups there are.
Great. So today when you write your repeated addition sentences, you need to know 2 things. Read them with me. Press those hands. Normally we would try one more, but I want you guys to have a lot of time with your partners to practice this. So we'll save that for the discussion. I know, I'm excited too, Penelope. When you go back to your seats, 10 minutes of partner time. I wonder who's going to show how many in each group with the number and how many groups there are by the number of times they write their number. Get ready.
Great. So turn and tell your neighbor, what does this teacher do to clearly and concisely introduce and then stamp her key points? Go ahead. What does she do to concisely?
But purposely left it out. Yeah. That's like, I understand it now. And then not reading it. I don't know. It's interesting. But so it reminded me. Yeah, because you're not agreeing with it. And it was kind of like just for the turn. Yeah. I like to.
Leave the
Yeah. I wonder if the skeleton, like the frame is already there, and then they just get it for sure. That's like the juicy part. They give it, and you try to.
And like word folded, right? So like I think that shows how well she understands. Cool. All right. If you want to come back together, Ms. Prisman and Ms. Petty, do you guys mind you starting us off, and then we can see what else people have?
Awesome, thank you. I like how she had an anchor chart that was filled out with the exception of the key points so that she can go over those with her scholars, and that's what she was looking for. At the end, she used challenge language, like, I wonder who, and then she restated the key points again.
Great, right before they got to practice. Ms. Tyler was junior. You guys notice anything about the prompts she used? Or the stems, I guess.
Oh yeah, okay, sorry. We noticed in the beginning she really gave them most of the words they needed to use, but then when she went to the turn and talk, it was a more open-ended question.
Cool. Anything else? I think those are sort of two of the biggest things that I pulled out. Did anyone notice anything else that was helpful or important? Anything else on her visual anchor besides the stems that you noticed?
Pictures.
Yeah, she has the actual, so in terms of then thinking about the model, right, she has the actual representation as well, so that they can see it too. Perfect. So that brings us to, I think, what we'll be working on and the big idea here, which is that students need to see, right, so you have that picture. They need to say, so you think about the turn and talks. And then they need to practice the lessons, big ideas, because key points are introduced via models and targeted discussion, or turn and talk questions. So think about how you introduce them, knowing that you're going to show it, then you're either going to ask those really targeted questions or give them the turn and talk. Then you're stamping it via a concrete visual anchor. So using that visual anchor to just make it extra clear what exactly they take away. And then, and we'll actually talk about this in a moment, consolidated via turn and talks, choral response, and prompts during practice. So you have a place to jot those down at the bottom of your notes if you want. And then we'll get a little bit deeper as we get into practice. Cool. So let's just talk briefly now about introducing a key point specifically. So 3 moves, and again, these are not in order. Instead, they're best practices or principles. So the first one is, you can start with an exemplar or a thinking job. And the point there is to show students the key point in action, right? So listen as I blank, or look at this example. What do you notice about? Then, during the turn and talk, you're hunting. So you're looking to see if there's a student you can call on who will be able to explain the key point to the class. Or you're targeting via really specific questions. So as Ms. Talley pointed out, you're doing what we saw in this video. You're saying, so I drew 3 groups, or I circled 3 groups. Why did I circle 3 groups? Why did I write the number 3? Why did I write it 5 times? So you're targeting if they don't have it right away. And then the last thing, and I think this is really essential, is that when it comes to key points, right is right. And so you're not going to have them restated if they're not restating it correctly. You pause the discussion, and then you say it if you're going off track. So some best practices or guidelines or pitfalls, I think, to try and avoid. One is just going all what and not how. So thinking of my example, if I just told you what author's perspective was, that's really different than showing you how to find it. Number 2 is following students down the rabbit hole, right? So if I say to you, what did I do to find author's perspective? And you start just naming all these random content words, so you start saying main idea, topic, total, part, whole, you start talking about math. We're not going to engage there. I'm going to say pause and call on somebody else. And then last of all, there's a pitfall, I think, to round up without actually stamping the key point, right? So if the student hasn't actually said what the key point is, to say, yes, that's right, and then move on. And so it's really important that if they're not all the way there, to say, this is exactly what it should be. So, stamping a key point, very similar. You replace the notes on the second page. The first thing is to leverage your visual anchor. One of the things that I love about that math video is that her blanks are literally for each word. And so you can see how well she knows her key point and how concise she forces herself to be as a result. It's really important to do a turn and talk or choral response both before and after the key point. And so doing it after, or having students say it after, is that final at bat that has them lock it in. And then again, right being right, before you go into that lesson, making sure that you know exactly what you want to hear them say, word for word. And again, a few pitfalls, right? One is having, I think, just like the incorrect key point. So if it's not the exact language that you want. Two is to not take the time to think through what the key words are. So we did lots of call and response for author's perspective rather than opinion, and that was really intentional. And then three is moving on before they've had a chance to actually say the key point. And so that amazing moment where the class is repeating the key point back is really the linchpin of where it gets stamped. So all of that brings us to our core idea. Mr. Mathis, can you read it for us?
To internalize a key point, scholars need to see it, say it, and do it again, and do it again.
Great.
And do it and do it.
Yeah.
They need to do it again.
Again. Do you want to do it? Do you want to do it again? Sure. Go ahead. No. They. I think that the key principle, right, and this is the core idea, this is the essence of it, is that if we just say something once, if we just have them repeat something once, and then assume that they've locked it into their long-term memory, there's all this evidence of cognitive science and of our own experience that shows that that's not sufficient. And so we want to give them as many at-bats as possible of the smallest possible bets. Okay, so now comes the fun stuff. In blue, you have a first grade math lesson plan. And you might be thinking, I don't teach first grade math. That makes two of us, because I don't either, and I certainly did my best to figure this out. So Ms. Olical, I sort of beefed up the key points for the purposes of this session, just so that everyone would be able to access them. And so you have access to the objective, you have access to what and how key points, and then on the back, you have an example of what student work might look like. And so just to sort of get everybody onto the same page, students are essentially learning to add numbers between 10 and 20. The idea is that you're taking one number and you're making cubes with it. So you would take, a 9, and you would take out 9 cubes, have them all attached. You have a 4, you have 4 cubes all attached. You're going to break apart your smaller number, which is your 4, take one guy off to make a 10, and then add up from 10, because that's easier. So you're trying to help kids in their head essentially say 9 plus 4 is really the same thing as 10 plus 3. Oh, and 10 plus 3 is easy, I know that, it's 13. So 9 plus 4 is 13. So that's a little bit of background on the lesson. I am going to give you 6 minutes to script an introduction. So you have a chance to script an introduction. The idea is to focus on how you're going to introduce the key points, targeted questions, and then specific words that scholars must use or say. So, if you're not a math teacher, you're going to give it your best shot. Go. You have room in your handout to play. Okay, I'm going to ask folks to just pause wherever you are. And what I'm going to do is actually put up my example of how I introduced the key points. Two things I want you to look for. So one is that this is just the introduction. So this is actually not the part where we're stamping it on the visual anchor, we're having the turn and talk where they say it aloud and things like that. This is just me showing it to them with a thinking job. So I'll show you the part where I stamp it in a moment. As you look at it, I want you to think about how I'm making the key points clear to scholars and how I'm showing it to them. So just look at my exemplar and take about a minute to read it. And this is the same thing that's on the back of your page too. Great. Turn and talk to the person next to you. What is one thing that you want to include in your introduction that is not in there right now? Go ahead.
I didn't either. I was just like,
To show, right? Yeah. Cool. Please say that. Great. If I can bring everyone back together, Ms. Wong's just going to share one thing that she noticed about some of the differences between ELA and math.
When I was like trying to plan it out, I was like trying to match like what he did with ELA, like giving the key points first and then doing the example, but after reading this it makes so much more sense for the kids to see it and then to pull out the key points, which also makes sense because that's usually what I do.
Cool. So I think probably at this point, right, you can imagine how after this you might say like, turn and talk to your neighbor. How did I make my 10? Or what did I do to make my 10, right? So that gets us to the fun part, which is where we stamp the key point. So same thing, script your stamp, plot out a sample visual anchor, the choral responses and the turn and talks that you'll use, and then think about some right is right. So what exactly do you want scholars to say in that moment where you're stamping your key points? So take about 4 minutes to do that. You can also revise your intro. Go ahead. We have about 2 minutes left. Remember, you can use the back of that paper too, where you'll see a sample if you're confused. Cool, as I'm walking around and seeing folks doing these visual anchors that have blanks that you're filling in, which I think is really exciting. I'm also seeing visual anchors that have sort of like the example itself on them, which I think is really smart as well. Good job. Great. If you just want to pause for a second, we're going to do something very similar to what we did before, which is I'm going to show you my visual anchor and my sample. Your job is going to be, again, what is one thing that you would want to do to potentially revise the moment where you stamp your key points. So this is what I wrote. And then this is my visual anchor, and I'll turn the lights so you can see the visual anchor more in a moment. But I said, so before we practice, let's remind ourselves of exactly what I did. So first I read the problem, and then I found the, yeah, you guys got it, you guys figured it out. So I found the, great. So then I take that smaller number and I break the smaller number into cubes. And I count the cubes I need to make my
10.
And I add the to find my beautiful. So let's read it all together. I take and then you guys get it. So take 1 minute to talk to the person next to you. What is one potential revision you could make to your stamped key points script? Go ahead. All right, if you guys could come back together. Diana's going to start us off, and then we'd love to hear other ideas people have. Go ahead, Diana.
Thank you. Laura and I were just talking about how you use sequence words, but we really wanted them to think more just like overall critically, so we don't actually have to give them like a procedural directions, because we want them to understand like the whole overall objective.
Cool. Other things that people noticed, a revision you would want to make to your stamp. Yes, Mr. Mavis, thanks.
The top in your visual aid, I had something like pretty similar, but I just like didn't do number 4, which is like bringing it back to like, I stopped at like 10 plus 3, but like no, we're actually like doing this to figure out like 9 plus 4. And I just completely left that out.
Cool. Yes, Ms. Chrisman.
Thank you. I like how there's the visual aid on top, or like you're breaking it apart for our scholars that can't read. So it's one thing to have like a bunch of words on a chart, but to actually like physically show what you need to do, I think is great.
Awesome. Anything else? I think just to stamp also what Tanya said, that I think like connecting all of this, right? So you might, you do this aloud, and then you're going to say, so how did making a 10 help me add 9 plus 4? Turn and talk to your neighbor. And then you're walking around and listening and hunting, and so someone's going to say, it's really important that you took the smaller number. And so when you come back together, you're going to say, Teresa, like, what number did I break apart? Teresa says 4. I'm like, why did I do that? Why did I do 4? Teresa says, because it's the smaller number. And suddenly, like, you're starting to cook now, and you can start to stamp those key points. So, here's what's going to happen now. You're going to get 1 more minute to revise your script, and then you'll actually deliver the introduction and stamping with partners. So, take 1 more minute to put any finishing touches on your script, your pretend visual anchor, and then we'll go in pairs, and we will practice. Okay, I'm going to ask folks to pause wherever they are. And if you'll flip to your very back page, you'll see there's a little feedback cheat sheet specifically around introducing and stamping. And so I am going to ask everyone to take 30 seconds to review that cheat sheet and then to underline one thing that you want to try to do. So take 30 seconds to do that. Great. Okay. So, last direction. I'm going to ask you to stand up and find a partner. Here's the only rule. Your partner cannot be the person sitting next to you. Once you find your partner, just stand next to them. Please do not start. So, you've got 30 seconds to find a partner. Can't be the person sitting next to you. Go. Here's what we're going to do. Ms. Wong, can you flip-flop with Ms. Eddings?
Yes.
Good. Ms. Eddings, can you be partners with Ms. Olical?
Oh, hey.
And then Diana, can you be partners with Ms. Gaines? And then Ms. Rusko, can you start? Okay. You're going to get 2 minutes to introduce and stamp. What? Sorry. I don't want to make sure, because if we all start on time, then we all end on time. So 2 minutes to introduce and stamp, 1 minute of feedback, and then you'll switch. There isn't necessarily a redo. If in that 1 minute you have time to quickly say something again, go for it. Start by calling your shot, and then get right into it. It's only 2 minutes, so make the most. Ready? Call your shot, and go.
My shop is
think for them is the answer.
To make it 10, I find my small one more I know how. I combine my 10 and my I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Wait, so what did I do then I find the smaller then we're turning into
sorry, Frank.
or I guess I like
Write it down.
yeah, I would even like
Teachers! Cool, just want to pause folks. You have 1 minute of feedback, and then I'll just bring it back together and we'll get into our next round of practice. Go ahead, 1 minute of feedback, go.
that's like the problem. They can understand like conceptually, but then they just don't.
Teachers!
Yes.
Yeah.
Great, so I just want to pause people, call out 2 bright spots, and then 1 piece of batched feedback. And so just bright spot wise, Miss Hinch did a great job of just stamping the thinking job. So she was really careful about saying, like before she moved on, what are you listening for, Ella? And so just making that really clear. So that's great. And then number 2, I thought Bailey's economy of language was really strong. So she was like, you know, now what I do is I make, and was just really clear about saying like that's what she's doing in that moment. And so those words, and she had gestures to match. Great. Here's the piece of batched feedback I would give. So we know that when we introduce the key point, particularly in math, it's really important to have that thinking job, and the focus is on them seeing it. And so if you overload call and response in that moment, it is harder, I think, for them to see exactly what you want them to see. So for the next person who goes, I would try and make sure, like, can you exaggerate your model and sort of turn down your call and response to try and really help scholars see what you want them to see. And then you can also skip into the stamping if you're ready. So you could just be like, turn and talk, what did I do, da, 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 and then start to stamp. So high five, partner 1. Good. And then partner 2, start by calling your shot. 2 minutes. Let's go.
And we'll see that it's a lot easier to add and use it.
We're going to learn how to make A10. It can be really tricky to add some numbers.
Smaller number.
I might in the model
Just find these smaller numbers.
I think you just encourage
We're going to break that apart.
smaller number.
That number apart.
Yes. Yes.
First thing we're going to do is find our smaller part. Once we found our smaller part, we're going to break that apart into parts. Next we're going to take and make a 10. Once we make a 10, we'll add our newest square. It is much easier to add once we've made a 10.
Now we're going to add the leftover to 10 and we have 30.
Now that we've made our 10, it's so much easier to add. Now that we already have
First
10.
step is
Our 10.3 is the exact same as 9 plus 1. By making it 10, we made it
we should find this. I think
turn it off to your neighbor.
what was it?
Turn it off to your neighbor. What did we do to make it 9 plus 4?
Teachers! Great, take 1 minute to give your partner feedback, please. If you have time, obviously you can do one little part quickly again. Go.
I would either turn and talk or then they're listening to. I think that's fine.
No, that's what I want. Teachers!
Yes.
Teachers!
Yes.
Beautiful. I do want to just bring folks together, again, quickly hit a pair of right spots. So, 3 things. One, I got to hear Ms. Krisman, and so she did a really nice job of both sort of modeling the non-example, so she counted on her fingers and was like, wow, this is taking me a really long time. So in terms of helping scholars see the difference, made that really clear. And then had a really nice turn and talk at the end of her introduction where it was, so turn and talk, if you wanted to make a 10, how would you do that? Go. I thought that Ms. Frank, and I actually think this is one of the real benefits of like having folks that don't have the content come in and do it. So she did a great job of just like framing her model. So she said, you know, I'm gonna teach you guys this trick to like, or I'm gonna do a trick as I add to make this go even faster. So watch me and see if you can figure out what the trick is. And so again, like, right, like really clear thinking job, really clear listening job with that frame. And then last of all, I thought Ms. Junior did a really nice job of starting to stamp her key point at the end. So coming out of that turn and talk, being really clear of like, you make, where you take, you find or take, you break, and you make that 10. And so again, just remembering that introduction, you frame, they see it, and then in the stamp, they say the exact words you want them to say. So when you come back to your seats, there's a spot for you to just reflect and lock in next steps for yourself on the next page. So how will introducing and stamping key points in this way impact your students? Take 1 minute to just jot down thoughts. Go. Sorry, so you have a spot for you to reflect. If you're gonna put your pencils down, I'm just gonna call on some of our first grade folks to start us off, and then we'd love to hear some other thoughts as well. So Tanya and then Teresa, you mind starting us off?
Yes, thank you. Scholars will get to work right away because they have clear expectations. They know exactly what needs to be done, and they can also refer back to the visual aid if needed.
Cool.
I said also along the same lines that they have a picture and words, so they have access to both.
Awesome. And then other folks that don't necessarily teach this exact lesson that was in front of you, how do you think this will impact your students? Yeah, Ms. Gaines and then Ms. Finch and then Ms. Wong.
I think it would keep me consistent not only in the lesson but throughout, across classrooms that I see throughout the school, and give scholars something solid to grasp, which I think is pretty essential, knowing that I only see them once a week.
I think it would make it more, the actual anchor chart widely accessible for the class, because right now I notice when I pre-write my key points, my highs will use it as a resource, but when we create it together, then it's more accessible to everyone because they saw the process that it took for the key points to make sense.
When scholars like start practicing, they're practicing this correctly. So if you see like mistakes, it's probably a different kind of misconception, and so you can like pull and address other things that are happening, and it shouldn't be like this, because like it should be clear that what they're doing.
Cool. Yes, Mr. Christian.
Outside the technicalities, I think scholars will be excited about seeing these anchor charts as well, because I noticed when you gave us the school-wide step to work on stems, my scholars are always looking on my board and trying to see what's going on. Even if they're working on the computer, they're really curious about what's Mr. Christian writing on the board. So I think they'll be incentivized to pay attention to what you're going to offer them.
Cool. And then I think just to put a stamp on that, right? These anchor charts, you can keep them up, and so the idea is that they can refer back to them. And so then to Ms. Wong's point, if you see those misconceptions happening again, you have sort of a quick remedy to address it. So one, I just want to thank folks for the diligent practice, for the hard planning. We're going to plow ahead for the next 10 minutes or so around consolidating prompts. And I think that if we need to revisit this, we definitely can. So we're going to go back to that lesson on the Aurora Borealis. And remember that we're learning about author's perspective. So I'm just going to keep this here. Just so you guys have it. And then we're going to pretend that we're still, we're going to basically keep reading. And your job is to just think about, what do I do or say to consolidate the key point? So you've already heard it now. We've said it all together. So what do I do or say to consolidate it? And we're going to start on the second page where it says, but why is this only at night? Okay? Great. Okay. So, but why is this only at night? The auroras shine all day and all night, just as stars do. During daylight, the sun outshines them. The best time to see the northern lights is between midnight and 2 o'clock a.m. Is it worth staying up that late? You bet. Especially when the solar wind is so strong that the lights are as colorful as they can be. Can somebody remind me, what am I supposed to do if I want to find the author's perspective? What am I looking at? Yes, Tanya?
Thank you. What the author thinks or feels.
Great. And so I'm going to look really closely at their specific words, and then what do I ask myself? Yes?
Ask yourself if they're positive or negative words.
Got it. So let me see. It says, is it worth staying up that late? You bet. So let's use our rule, which is we're going to look and ask if it's positive or negative. Does that seem like a positive or a negative thing? If it's worth it to stay up that late? Show me. Cool. Back in star. Yes, it seems like a positive thing. Great. Let me keep reading. The northern lights take on different shapes. Shimmering means glowing, curtains, colored clouds twisting and turning, and arcs of colors covering the entire sky. Let me pause for just 1 second. If something is shimmering or glowing, that's a really big, specific word for the author to use. So I'm going to look really closely at that word. And I know that when something's glowing or glittering, that's a really positive thing. This author's perspective is probably that the lights are beautiful. Scholars.
Yes.
Quickly turn and tell your neighbor, what did I do to figure out that the author thinks that the northern lights are beautiful? Go. Great, back and start. Ms. Frank, what did I do?
You read and you found words and you thought to yourself, how does the author feel? Or what are they thinking? The end.
Amazing. Can you turn and tell your neighbor in your own words? What did Ms. Frank just say? Go. Oh, Ms. Evans, now you have a turn to talk. Yes, great. Okay, back and start. All right, in your own words, what would you say I did, Ms. Talley?
I'd say you looked at the author's words and thought to yourself if they were positive or negative.
Yeah, exactly. Great. So pause. Okay, so take a second now, you can just jot this down. So what are some notes on prompts that I used to refer you back to the key points during the model? Go ahead. Teachers.
Yes.
Cool. And I'm moving quickly out of respect for you guys mostly. There are 4, I think, like key times when you can consolidate knowledge. So that's different than introducing it to scholars for the first time. It's different than stamping it, which is making sure it's locked in. So now is when they're practicing information that they have to commit it to their long-term memory. So the first one would be after you've introduced the key point. So you might say, right before we start to read, right, like, so whenever we see a stem that asks us about author's perspective, we know to look at the words and to ask if the author's words are positive or negative. Then, after a model, you might say, what's our rule, right? What's the rule that we use? If you're show calling a student's work, you can say, in your own words, what did blank do? And then before independent practice begins, you can say, what will I see in your answer? Right? So in this case, you want to be like, I'll see you cite the author's specific words and talk about if they're positive or negative. So the idea is to give you guys 4 really concrete stems that you can now use to consolidate key points at any time in a lesson. And these are adaptable across contents. So just quickly turn and tell the person next to you, what is one time you could see yourself using one of these prompts? Go. Teachers. Great. Ms. Frank, can you say what you were just saying a moment ago?
I was just saying that I like the idea of them stating in their own words what I've taught, because it really does stick in their brains. You know, musicians, it takes like 75 times of doing something before it's really memorized, and then stating in their own words is just, it's like a deeper understanding than just repeating it.
Yeah, I think there's research that you have to hear a word about 67 times before you commit it to your long-term memory. And so I think for us, when we think about like in a listening and learning lesson, if we're like, mirrors and words, and then the word is like, you know, hemisphere, and then all of a sudden we're like, Caitlin, what's a hemisphere? And Caitlin's like, like she's heard it once, she needs to hear it 73 more times, right? It's not her fault. So I think that's just a really important thing to think about, and that I think brings us to that core idea again, which is that they need to see it, they need to say it, they need to do it, and do it, and do it again. So you're going to take the last 3 minutes right now to plan one prompt you could use. So we're going to sort of shrink the practice a little bit. Plan one prompt that you could use for the same lesson that we've been using. So you can either pretend it's right before independent practice begins, it's during independent practice as you circulate, it's during a mid-lesson pause and you're show calling exemplary work, or it's during a mid-lesson pause and you're unpacking an error, or you're sending scholars back to work after that mid-lesson pause. So you're going to script one prompt that you would use to consolidate your key point. Go. It's for the math lesson that you've been using, not for a work. It's only one, right? Yeah. That is like, I did this. All right, and pause wherever you are, please. We'll do the same thing, which is I'll show you some prompts that I came up with. And then would love for you to just turn and talk to the person next to you about one of these that you like and why you like it. So one prompt that you like and why you like it. Cool. One prompt that you like and why you like it. Go ahead. Great. Teachers! Cool. What did you guys come up with? Would love to hear.
Sure.
Yeah, please.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I liked the question, what did I forget to do? And then you gave answers like take, break, make. So it gives like our lower scholars access so they're still able to participate. But also when they're making a mistake during their independent practice, they're able to figure out what, it gives them an opportunity to think like, oh, I forgot this, and think back.
Right, you can just say you forgot to take or you forgot to make or whatever. Cool. Yeah, Mr. Christian, please.
So on that same note, I didn't notice it before, but all the words kind of rhyme. And so
I was really proud of myself. So thank you for that.
I turned it into a song. I said, you know, they could sing it and be like, as we go back to our desk, we gotta remember to take the smaller number, break the smaller number, count the cues and make it 10.
Yeah.
Add the leftovers to find what the total is. So
yeah, cool.
they can sing that in their head. So.
Yeah, and I think that just to like actually, I think like put a stamp on that, right? Like when the key points are really concise, like there's no extra words, then like you can do that, right? And you commit them to your long-term memory faster. So I appreciate that. Anything else people took away around prompting? Yeah, Caitlin.
We've been struggling with like scholars listening to each other when they're answering out loud. So I love the like in your own words, what did so and so do? Just so that they're always on it.
Awesome. Yep. And I think that's a really great way of also making sure that they're not just trying to repeat what you said, right? So love that. So we're gonna just end, and I think that I'll ask you to sort of just like really in your brains probably just think about like what are you gonna do to make sure that this happens in your classroom and key points look different. And so I think just think on that for a second, and then we can hop up to the front desk for gratitude. Please take your trash from Ms. Catalano's classroom. And then if you want, yeah, no put test bag on the desk. And then it looks like there are some wings of the virtual table left. So it's up to you. There's the big ones.
Thank you.